Hey, my slides made it. Jet lagged as hell, by the way. So I'm going to talk about connectome generative modeling today. Just as an aside, you should have access to these slides as PDFs, but at the bottom, there's a GitHub repository that not only has access to the PowerPoint version of these slides, there's a lot of animations built in, but it also has a Jupyter notebook with some of these examples worked through. You can download it and kind of play around with it yourself. There's even some like advanced user questions that you can explore yourself. I'm also a MATLAB chauvinist, so it's written in Python. So if you discover that there are errors, please tell me. And well, actually, don't tell me. Just work through them. So I'll talk about connectome generative modeling. Let's see if I can get these slides to advance. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance. Do I need a mouse? There we go. Oh, no, is there a clicker? Am I really not able to do this? This guy? No? Yeah, where's the clicker? Oh, the green. Okay, the big play button. That'll work. Okay, so my talk was going to follow the following outline. There's a lot of overlap with what people have already talked about too, so that's kind of nice. I'm going to try to position generative modeling, which is a little bit distinct from the null models. I'm going to try to position it with respect to null modeling. I'll cover what I consider to be the goals of generative modeling, followed by a discussion of some of the canonical generative network models. And I'll finish with an introduction of a neuroscientific model, along with some advances in that space, extensions of the model, and kind of like the outlook of generative modeling and network modeling in neuroscience. As I said, there's a GitHub repository with code for implementing, I think, every model that I talk about. Okay. So again, there's some overlap here with what other people have said, but we study brain networks and network neuroscience, and for the last 20 years, we spent a lot of time trying to enumerate the interesting properties of brain networks. I'm going to focus on diffusion MRI and structural connectivity in my talk. And if you're unfamiliar with how we build brain networks, take diffusion MRI and tractography data to reconstruct white matter tracks, discretize and parcelate our brain so we have a series of individual nodes, wire those nodes or parcels up based on streamline measures, and then retain that network for subsequent analysis. Again, we know a lot about this connectome, at least we think we do. We've measured very interesting properties, like local clustering, a measure that I'm not going to focus on because it's already been introduced. We've measured the path length of the network, and together, the high local clustering and short average path length tells us about the so-called small world property. We've measured and we've observed heterogeneous degree distributions, so a small number of nodes make more connections or seemingly more important than others, suggesting that they might be hubs, and that those high degree nodes, they form a cross-linked subnetwork called a rich club. They connect to one another. We've also have observed modular structures, so dense subnetworks that we think support specialized information processing. And as Andrew alluded to in his last talk, connectomes are positioned in a way so that they have far more short-range connections than long, which we think is related to this wiring cost reduction principle. So these are just a handful of the properties that we've kind of focused on in network neuroscience. And what null models do is they ask the question, or rather they try to answer the question, should I be surprised in a statistical sense that my network has a particular property? So we can consider the space of all networks. They sit in some high-dimensional space. Our network occupies some specific position in that space. And around it are all of the other possible networks. And in a null model, when we're doing null modeling, we ask, do those networks have properties that are similar to ours? But it's not really fair to compare against the entire space, so we restrict our comparisons to subspaces, starting maybe with other networks that have the same number of nodes, so our subspace is big. The same number of edges, we gradually zoom in. The same degree sequence, we're zooming in further and further. And somehow, by the way, the resolution of these images didn't copy well, so such is life. And in the end, we estimate some probability that these random networks, or the other networks nearby in this space, have shared properties as ours. This is what null models do. This is what the last two speakers have kind of talked about. But it can sometimes be dissatisfying. right, the exact answer of whether a property is surprising or not, it depends on which set of networks we compare against, right? If we compare against a very unconstrained space versus a highly constrained space, we might get a very different answer to that question. Similarly, statistical likelihood doesn't necessarily have any implications for functional relevance of a particular measurement. This is also introduced very nicely in a 2016 paper from Mika Rubinov, who argue there are so-called spandrels in brain networks. This is due to correlations with network statistics, that when we lock in certain features, others necessarily follow along, right? And so we might be falsely led to believe that a byproduct, a spandrel like the Rich Club, is important or statistically interesting, but in reality it might be a property that just comes along for free when you have networks with modules and hubs, right? So it can be kind of dissatisfying. But that's what we do. An alternative approach, a kind of a complementary approach, is so-called generative modeling. Rather than asking, should we be surprised that our network has some property, we ask the question, how did my network come to have this set of properties or this set of features? And we do this in a fairly simple way or a kind of programmatic way. We first have to decide on which features we care about, right? So we have a set of features that we might want to recapitulate with our models. We have to propose a set of generative mechanisms, a set of models or rules that give rise to synthetic networks, right? We can fit the parameters of those models, try to get them as close as possible to the real thing, to our observed network. And when we're done with that, we can compare performance. We can ask which of these wiring mechanisms, which of these synthetic networks get as close as possible to our observed network. Right? We can maybe measure some kind of fitness or distance from our observed network. And then we ultimately try to improve our model in some way. We figure out what we missed, identify new mechanisms, and the cyclical process it repeats. Right? We improve our models and we go through these same steps again and again. That's generative modeling in a nutshell. Why might we do this? It sounds like a lot of work. It is. But there's some very nice reasons why we might want to. First is compression. If I had a network and I wanted to transmit that network to you in some way, I could just give you the edge list, the set of nodes that are connected. I could even give you their weights if I wanted to. And you can reconstruct that network faithfully, without any loss. You can reconstruct it perfectly. But we might be, that's a long list. It takes a lot of bits to encode, especially for really, really big networks. But if we had a generative model that gave rise to networks that had most of the edges correct, or recapitulated most of the properties, maybe I would be willing to tolerate a small number of errors and omissions in my edge list. My mechanism is really simple, and it results in kind of a compression of our network. Right? Rather than a big, long edge list, we have a rule that gives rise to an edge list with errors, but approximates the correct one. Our generative models also have parameters. We fit them. We can do our brain behavior associations with those parameters, link them back to phenotypes from the individual brains that they corresponded to. But where generative modeling gets really exciting, in my opinion, is that it allows us to make predictions, too. Generative models, wiring rules, they make predictions about networks that start in two different locations. They make predictions about, given this rule, where will the network end up as we start adding edges back? And sometimes those networks end up in very different configurations. Some that look more like a diseased brain, others that look like a traditionally a normal brain, for lack of a better word. And when we can make predictions, we can also try to do interventions. We can ask, given this model, it says that this brain will evolve along some trajectory towards an unfavorable final state. Can we identify perturbations that would bump our network back on a track or into some regime that allows it to evolve towards a favorable configuration? And then lastly, if our models are informed enough, if they resemble the neurobiology enough and the biophysics, then they can actually serve as models of biological growth, evolution, and network formation. I think we're kind of far from this, but there's a few examples that I'll cite at the end where we get a little bit closer. So, generative modeling in a nutshell. And by the way, interrupt me if something is unclear, too. I'm happy to take breaks. This is kind of a modular talk, so we can stop at any point, too. So, generative models, we're using them in neuroscience, but there are a handful of enshrined models that come from network science proper. I want to review some of these to kind of highlight what I mean by a generative model. I kind of talked through it at a high level, but to see some of these in action, I think it makes it clear what a generative model is versus a null model, and kind of how those goals diverge a little bit. So, arguably the simplest and oldest generative model is the Erdos-Renyi random graph. It is a structureless generative model. Andrew already introduced it, but essentially we start with n nodes, we grab 2 nodes at random and rewire them, or rather add a connection between them with some small probability. Do this for all pairs of nodes, and it gives rise to networks that look something like this. We can vary that density parameter, that wiring probability parameter, to give rise to networks of different densities. But ultimately, the networks are structureless, right? They don't have any of the features in common with real-world networks. But they've been studied for a long time, largely because they have derivable mathematical properties. The number of the probability that our network forms a single component, the size of the largest connected component, we can derive that analytically. And as, again, like Andrew noted, the degree distribution is binomially distributed. So there's lots of reasons, for mathematical reasons, why we might like this model, but it also serves as a foil and as kind of a historical antecedent to the more complex generative models that we see in the field now. So the more complicated models, the so-called Watts-Strogatz model of small world networks. So that ER network has basically no local clustering, but has very short path length. Another, I guess we could consider this a generative model, but the lattice graph, there's a question about this in the last Q&A, has extremely long path length, but very short, very high clustering, rather. In 1998, Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz noted that, hey, real-world networks don't look like either of these two things. So they proposed a model wherein, starting with a lattice graph, a little bit of rewiring is added. Grab a couple connections, swap them at random. Just add a couple random connections. And it turns out when P is small, when the probability of rewiring is small, you actually don't destroy that clustering at all. It's largely preserved. But path length drops precipitously, and it gives rise to the so-called small world regime, the set of p-values, a set of parameters in which we get networks that have these properties in common with real-world networks, namely short path length and high clustering. So I want to use this, by the way, to kind of revisit the introduction to generative modeling, exactly how this is a generative model. We identified a set of target features. We want to build networks that have short path length and high clustering. There were already 2 candidate models that failed to reproduce these 2 properties simultaneously. Watts and Strogatz, they proposed a third model, and that third model outperforms the other 2. So it allows us to adjudicate between these different mechanisms, these different possible explanations for real-world networks. But Watts-Strogatz models, they're nice, they get these 2 properties, but they miss others. The ER network has a binomially distributed degree distribution. The lattice graph has a delta distribution. Real-world networks don't look like either, so they're missing that too. They tend to be heavy-tailed, right? So enter the Barabasi and Albert model, which is another generative model. We're kind of progressing historically here. This is now 1999, when this model was first introduced. And it starts with a small clique, a small set of highly connected nodes, and gradually adds nodes to this network. We're going to grow a network by node addition. And those new nodes, as we add them, they're going to connect to the existing network, but they're going to connect in a preferential way. They're going to link to nodes proportional to their degree. So highly connected nodes in the network tend to inherit more connections. Right? I'm going to try to illustrate this growth process here. Right? So we've added one node. Now there's an imbalance. This node here in the right-hand corner makes more connections than the others. So as we add a new node, it's more likely to connect to that slightly higher degree node. And this process iterates, giving rise to a network with, too many animations. Giving rise to a network with heterogeneous degree distribution and in presence of hubs, in this case, one highly connected node. But if you were to continue this process indefinitely or until a certain number of nodes are added, it gives rise to heavy-tailed degree distributions, networks that have hubs. So that's kind of nice. Other properties that we can try to seek to replicate with generative models. Real-world networks have rich mesoscale structure. This is one of my favorite topics. They have subnetworks. Usually we think of these subnetworks as being assortative, meaning they tend to be sets of internally dense but externally sparse subnetworks, but they can be other things too. They can be disassortative. So red subnetwork doesn't connect to itself, but preferentially connects to the blue, or we can have a core periphery structure. All of the generative models we've talked about so far fail to account for this. So enter the stochastic block model. The stochastic block model imagines that each node in the network has a cluster label or a community assignment. And for if we have only two communities, we're going to restrict it to two communities for now, the probability that any two nodes are connected to one another, it only depends on their community labels, right? This kind of stochastic invariance. It doesn't matter, the exact identities of the nodes don't matter, it's just their cluster labels that matter. And so we can ask for any pair of nodes, we can look up their labels. Here's two nodes that are clustered or labeled as in the red cluster. Their probability depends on, that should be omega RR, but it should be the density of connection, or the probability of two nodes with the red cluster label being connected to one another. It doesn't matter which pairs of red nodes we grab, they all have the same probability. The same would be true for the blue to blue and blue to red. The probability of those connections forming depends only on this probability connection matrix. And we can generate networks from this. Once we choose those cluster labels, once we have this matrix, it generates modular networks with mesoscale structure. I'll just add that typically, this is not how we use the stochastic block model. Typically, we actually want to infer those parameters, the cluster labels, and the probability of connection between pairs of clusters. I won't go through that process, but essentially that's typically how this model is used. We actually want to invert it and guess those cluster labels and the densities to make the likelihood that this model generated our observed network as big as possible. Yet another feature, and this has come up again in the talk, so it's nice to see them dovetail in this way. Many real-world networks are spatial networks, meaning that the probability of two nodes connecting depends somehow on the geometry of the network or their locations in some space. Well, geometric random graphs can do this. They can replicate this property. The simplest version of these is to embed our nodes in some metric space and then connect nodes that are separated by a distance less than some threshold parameter. And I'll show you some examples of these. So here, each of these nodes have a position, and the threshold parameter here is very small, so we only connect highly proximal nodes to one another, resulting in an extremely sparse network. That's the density here. But as we increase the threshold parameter and allow more distant nodes to connect, the density of the network increases as well, but still forming a tight, spatially connected network. But I'll point out this model is deterministic, given a set of coordinates, distance metric, and threshold. If we want a stochastic version of this, we can form connections probabilistically. Right, so we have our embedding, we have a distance matrix, and we fix some parameters. In this case, we're going to scale the probability and raise it to an exponential, where the decay rate is some parameter that we get to choose. That defines some probabilities, and we can generate networks from that probability distribution. And I'll point out that here, these synthetic networks, they are stochastic. From run to run, they will not be identical. They'll have different topologies, which is kind of nice. Okay. So, a quick interim summary. Networks have architectural properties. No duh. I'm an elder millennial, so I still say duh. Null models test whether we should be surprised that our network has these properties. In contrast, generative models ask us how those properties came to be in the first place. There are a handful of canonical models. Each of these models seek to replicate very specific architectural features, but real-world networks tend to have all of these features, or many of these features, simultaneously, especially brain networks. So what might a generative model for a brain network actually look like? So enter Petra Vertish in 2012, who proposed what I'll call a quasi-dynamic model. This model's got a lot of life out of it, a lot of use, especially recently. It's kind of been reinvigorated by a few groups. And the quasi-dynamic model works this way. It imagines that we start with a small seed network. You can pretend that this is a brain. Right now I'm just making a simple ring graph with some connections. And the edges are going to be added probabilistically. So we're going to grow the wires of this network. The probability that any additional edge gets added, it's going to depend upon spatial proximity. This is the distance between two nodes, the Euclidean distance raised to some parameter eta. Right, so if we have a distance matrix here, white is super close, nodes that are super close to one another, black are nodes that are distant from one another. We'll take that matrix and raise it usually to a negative power. And what that does is it creates a probability where nodes that are close to one another are more likely to become connected. But in addition to this spatial dependency, this is a lot like the geometric random graphs I just showed you. But in addition to this spatial dependency, Petra said, well, let's add in some non-spatial constraints. We know that spatial models don't give us everything. They give us a lot. They explain a lot, but they don't recapitulate our networks exactly. So let's add some non-spatial term, a topological term. I'm going to illustrate just one version here, and I'll unpack this in a subsequent slide. But here, the topological term is we're going to scale this probability based on nodes' degree, the product of their degree. This way, two nodes that are highly connected, if they aren't already connected, it's very likely that at a subsequent step, they will become connected in the future. We can substitute other topological terms, and I'll go through some of these in a moment. But it's essentially the idea. We have this additional term. It's space plus, geometry plus. And when we combine them, we get our probability matrix. It's this matrix literally multiplied by the other one, in an element-wise fashion. Okay? And then we're going to add, as we add edges, by the way, the distance between nodes doesn't change, but their topological properties do. So we're constantly updating this topological term. As we add new nodes, their degrees change, the number of neighbors they have in common changes, their clustering changes. So we have to update this topological term at each step. Okay? So a few notes in this model. So I'm presenting it as is, but there's a few things that are worth noting. I already said that this topological term is quite flexible. Here we use the degree product, the product of two nodes' degrees, and this kind of forces nodes that are highly connected to connect to one another. But there's other flavors that we could choose as well. We could choose the maximum of two nodes' degrees, the minimum, the absolute difference, how many neighbors they have in common. This is where you, as the user, get to be creative. And I'll highlight some creative uses that have been used in the literature already. But you get to substitute what you want in place of this topological term. Exciting, but also a little bit daunting, right? There's a lot of strategies for fitting this model, right? On one hand, generally, we need to define some objective function. In other words, it tells us how good our generative model is doing. One possibility is to choose exact overlap. Good generative models are ones that recapitulate exactly the topology of our observed network. But that can sometimes be dissatisfying. I'll give an example here. I think I'm borrowing this from slides that Petra shared with me many, many years ago. But imagine we had an observed network with a path length of 3.06, okay? If I swap one connection, remove this one, and just place it here, I've changed the path length by quite a bit. I've changed it by a lot. I've just moved one connection, and I've changed the topological properties of this network by quite a bit. On the other hand, I could swap those three middle connections into certain configurations that effectively don't change the topological property of characteristic path length. So yeah, you could choose an objective function that is exact edge overlap, but sometimes that can be misleading, and here's a clear example of that. What's an alternative possibility? Is to compare the high-level properties of your network. Take your observed network and your synthetic network generated by the model, measure some property like degree, and here what I'm computing is the cumulative distribution function, the empirical cumulative distribution. And we can measure how far apart these two distributions are in a really simple way. The Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistic, it's literally the biggest gap between their two cumulative distribution functions. this chaos statistic has got a lot of usage in the generative modeling field. It's not perfect, it's heuristic, but it's a simple way to compare two networks based on some high-level properties. Right. So what could we do? We could choose a set of statistics that we'd like to recapitulate and measure their chaos statistics. And some function of those chaos statistics tells us how good a fit we have. For instance, we can measure nodes' centrality, clustering, degree, and edge length distributions. If we're getting close to all of those, then their individual chaos statistics are small, and the maximum of those will be correspondingly small. And it serves as a kind of energy or a distance from our reference network. There's other questions that come up, including the optimization algorithm. How do we choose our parameters? Because after all, there are two parameters, the eta, which controls the spatial dependency, and the gamma, which controls the topological term. One possibility is to do a grid search. So we simulate networks at different pairs of parameters. This can kind of be dissatisfying as well. This is a bit of a challenge. So here's some two-dimensional function. It's just a well positioned on some point, a multivariate multivariate normal distribution. If we do a coarse grid search versus a fine grid search, where that minima is, it can actually vary a little bit. So we have to be careful when we're doing grid search about choosing the granularity with which we're performing that search. Our sampling strategy matters as well. So one possibility is to, if we do a grid search, to just sample the centroids of each block in those grids. But that's imagining then that those are representative of all of the samples, all of the synthetic networks in each of those blocks. So another possibility is to sample parameters uniformly within each grid, within each block. Something's coming. There we go. Other possibilities, instead of grid search, is to use simulated annealing. So suppose we had a network at some particular set of parameters, shown here in magenta, and another network with a different set of parameters and different energies, importantly. We can use something called simulated annealing to explore the space of solutions, or we'll accept the move to the new location if the energy is smaller, if the fitness is better, or with some small probability that's proportional to this temperature term. And we're going to gradually decrease this temperature so that initially we do a very big, broad search of this space, but as the temperature decreases, we're going to gradually converge to only good solutions, ideally. This helps us avoid local minima in the landscape. So really quickly, I want to just walk through a case study. And I know I'm pushing time limits here, I think. We're okay. But really quickly, a case study. So we have our model, we have an objective function, we have an optimization algorithm, so we can put this in action. What do we see? In this particular study from way back in 2016, we had at the time 380 brains, which seemed like a lot, and we compared 13 different models that all had different definitions of this topological term. And we asked a bunch of questions, like first, how well does space alone account for the organization of the connectome? So we're going to set our gamma parameter to 0, so that topological term doesn't contribute at all. Well, we get an energy curve that looks something like this. So we find a very clear local minima. Well, that's the optimal networks with the purely spatial model. Why does it have that particular location? Well, at that particular location, it doesn't do a good job of matching the optimal clustering. It doesn't do a very good job of matching the optimal edge length distribution, but it's where those two intersect. It can't match either. The pure spatial model can give us networks that are as clustered as the observed network, or with as many long-distance connections as the observed network with a single parameter. So the pure spatial model, a purely geometric model, is not an optimal explanation for the connectome. But as I said, we tried a bunch of different parameters. The spatial model is here on the end, purely spatial model. This is the energy, lower is better. Where that topological term depends on degree comes next, then clustering, and then finally these measures of homophily. So we're counting how many connections nodes have in common with one another. When we input that as a topological term, we actually do a pretty good job of getting back networks that look like the real deal. And here is the energy landscape. I realize the screen's kind of hard to see, but there's a very clear, deep well where all of the brains are. Each red point is a brain. Okay. Now, on one hand, it's kind of unsurprising that our model can match all of these. After all, we have forced it to do that. So it's in the objective function, right? But does our model match other features of the brain, of the connectome incidentally? And it turns out that it does. Path length, efficiency, mean clustering, modularity, features that it wasn't explicitly selected for, right? And the model parameters are also broadly related with biological age, which is kind of nice. Okay. Now, I'm almost done. Just a couple words on extensions of this model and other applications. So I said, Petra invented it. We did stuff with it in 2016, but it's been like widely used now, and I think it's becoming even more widely used. So people have used this model in much narrower ranges of biological age, focusing on development, linking the parameters to biological age. They've linked it to risk for neuropsychiatric disorders, the actual trajectory of growth. People have studied this as well. So they have the model, edges are added over time, looking at the trajectories by which networks grow, and even coming up with ways to reduce the computational burden. I didn't say this explicitly, but boy, is it tough to simulate these things, and it's computationally expensive to do grid searches or simulated annealing. This recent paper really reduces that computational burden, so it's quite nice. And the simplicity of the model, 2 terms, 2 parameters, allows it to be extended, I think, in creative directions pretty easily. For instance, we can let that spatial term vary as the brain actually grows through development. Space doesn't stay constant. The distance between pairs of nodes expands, and we can actually incorporate that into the model to make it a little more plausible biologically. You can also throw away some of those topological terms and include a different term. For instance, data from spatial transcriptomics, right? Like the transcriptomic similarity of nodes. Allow that to inform the connection probabilities. The models, as I've described them so far, don't take into account edge weight. Well, luckily there's papers that are doing this. They've even used these models, they fit them to artificial neural networks that are actually doing tasks. And surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, the models that perform well in this particular study that are actually doing the task well are also, they tend to resemble the models that do well recapitulating real connectomes. It's kind of surprising. I focused on this Vertish style modeling. Sorry, Petra, I'm throwing your name here, attaching it to that if you ever watch this. That's what happens when you write the first paper, I guess. But there are alternative approaches as well. There are models that explicitly account for the timing of connections. So they imagine that there's different windows in time with which pairs of nodes can become connected to one another. Alex Golas had a really nice paper in 2019 that builds on some old Kaiser and Hilgetag papers. But essentially, there are windows within which, in this case, neurons can become connected to one another. And this becomes really critical when we start modeling real systems. So remember, I hinted early on that with enough annotation, with enough neurobiological detail, these models can start recapitulating actual growth mechanisms. Well, with C. elegans, we actually know when all these cells divide. We have their birth times. And back in 2013, they incorporated this timing into a model of C. elegans growth, and it actually does really well when you add back some of this biological detail. It outperforms models that do not. Right? So timing matters. Others have argued that connection growth should be modeled in space-time as opposed to a binary decision, this connection is here or not. We can actually grow the axons. So again, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into great detail, but this is an alternative approach, or a complementary approach. And we can even, again, use spatial transcriptomics data to inform the generative modeling here. In this case, mapping between the physical space of connections of neuron to neuron wires, and then their similarity, their closeness in gene expression space. But again, still striving for these simple and interpretable models. A few caveats, and then I'm going to be done, I promise. So generative growth mechanisms, so these kind of fall under like maybe concerns or things that we should be on the lookout for in the future. These are the generative models here. They're not necessarily designed to recapitulate development or biological growth. It's all stylistic. They're more compressive than anything else. They're seeking simple rules that explain the pattern of connectivity. They're not trying to model development. Their abstractness can be a blessing in the sense that it allows us to incorporate lots of different terms and fit them really simply, but it also presents a challenge, particularly because it's the abstractness makes it not particularly linked to developmental mechanisms. All of the models that I presented, every single one of them is a growth model. Either nodes or connections are added, but brains go through periods of pruning that are not captured by any of the models here. The models here also don't incorporate any plasticity mechanisms based on the timing of activity, for instance. And then also all the haters out there who don't like wires but focus on functional connectivity. The models I talked about are probably not appropriate for networks where the edges are functionally defined or statistically defined from functional activity. But there are models that might be appropriate for it. For example, neural mass models. I think some of the speakers after me will touch on this a little bit. There's lots of opportunities to extend this work. And as we have more data, annotations, developmental data sets that are longitudinal, or alternative spatial scales, finer spatial scales, generative models are just going to get better. Yep, and that's about it. These are stuff we already talked about. Networks have architectural properties. There's a bunch of old models that try to get at specific properties, but we need special models for brain networks that probably balance different wiring terms. And if you want to look at some of the slides or the notebook that accompanies them, you can go here. I'm also happy to chat afterwards. And I don't have a clock in front of me, but probably went too long. I'm happy to chat in the break coming up. Yeah, I'm done. Whew, okay. Always scared of a Zaleski question, but okay. Oh. Cindy, go ahead. I think, so I shouldn't say you can't apply it to functional connectivity. And in fact, the original Vertage paper did this. They applied it to functional brain networks. But I think the answer to why it may not be as appropriate as other models for functional connectivity comes back to the question that Andrew answered in his last talk. In functional connectivity, edges have transitivity when we define them using correlation. They're not formed independently. All of these models allow edges to form independently. So we are probably undershooting in some way, or at least not baking in this constraint explicitly. So I think that's why it may not that you couldn't do it, just that it comes with this additional caveat. Yeah. Question in the back, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. But in the beginning of the talk, you were mentioning that these models can also be used for prediction and for intervention.
Yeah.
But now we're excluding the actual relationship with physical time in these models. So what kind of prediction?
Well, I think it's not wholly missing here. Let's see if I can figure out how to go back again. There are models that study the temporal. Boy, in my old lab, it used to be every time you go back a slide, you owe people a beer for every slide you go back because it's really jarring to the audience. So don't hold me accountable to that. I'm going back a lot of slides. So I think people are very interested in this, the exact temporal trajectory by which networks grow. So this is a really nice study that actually, with different parameters, different positions in parameter space, occasionally there's convergence in terms of where networks end up, the trajectory by which they get there. But oftentimes they're not. They end up in different spaces too. So I think this is the kind of study that I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about prediction. It allows you to make a prediction about where I anticipate a network to be later on. It's not physical time at this point. It's an arbitrary time unit. But with that limitation, I think that's what it's trying to speak to. And could we bump a network from one cone to another by changing a parameter? So something like that. Changing the wiring constraint. I think those are the kinds of interventions that I'm imagining. They're at this point super theoretical. As far as I know, the data don't exist to actually test this. Outside of maybe that C. elegans study with birth times. But that's not particularly exciting to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. It's exciting to me, but I think your point is well made. But I think it's maybe more of a pipe dream or a long distance dream than anything else. Yeah. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about model parsimony and model selection, given that the simplest model is one you guys had a lot of two-term models,
Yeah.
and now people are even doing three.
Yeah. Are there three-term models? That's terrifying. So just a quick note on parsimony. I'm going to start by making the point that these models are already wildly simple, right? They start with extreme parsimony. They're missing all kinds of biology. They're missing all kinds of developmental factors. That's totally abstracted away in the modeling. So they start with as simple a model as you can imagine. So we're starting already from a highly parsimonious point. I think your question is more to the point, as we start increasing the model complexity, shouldn't we expect more complicated models to outperform the simpler ones? And on one hand, that's true. But I think it also fits within the broader narrative that's coming up in these talks, is that we're testing, so it came up in the context of null models already, this progressive testing and trying to understand at what point, as we bake in more constraints, do we get something that looks like the real network? I think generative models follow a very similar kind of convergence like that. As we bake in more details, how much added explanatory power comes from the additional terms. That's something that's challenging to test, I think, in this case, statistically, because we don't actually have a likelihood function. We can't calculate AICs or BICs. But I think within that kind of nested model space, it allows us to test against alternative two-term models and adjudicate between models of equal complexity. I suppose there's room for improving on it and making it more analytic, like the likelihood term like block models have, but it's not here right now as far as I know. Andrew.
Just on that point, the question I was going to ask earlier, how do you see, so we have the very simple two-term models, but more recently, I've just been clicking through some of the posters and presentations here where we're using deep learning approaches to generate networks. We can put in a structural network and generative functional network, or put in certain properties and do an excellent reproduction. We still interpret the model. Yes. But what it generates is
much more faithful.
Yeah. And what's the future of that as someone that's been working in the field for so long? How do you see
I'm too old. The future is in other people's hands now. But I grew up academically in a lab that loved low-hanging fruit. I still say that to my students. So I see some of them, they've actually left. Great. But I always say, choose the low-hanging fruit, right? And that often means the interpretable model, as opposed to me at least, that suggests a more interpretable, parsimonious model, as opposed to one that is, maybe gives you a better fit, but it has this black boxiness to it. So I think you need both, or maybe a balance of both. I want to understand the model. I want to understand person. I want to be able to interpret it. I want to understand the contributions of different terms. In a deep learning, that becomes, you have to interrogate your model, I think, in a way that the simpler models you don't have to, where it's much more apparent which terms are contributing. So I think you probably need both. On one hand, you get something that has greater fidelity, but on the other hand, it's more complicated to interpret, or maybe even impossible. On the other hand, you have less fidelity, but an eminently interpretable model. Maybe they converge in the middle somewhere. I don't know. I'm speculative, but yeah. I don't know. Room for both. It's a big tent, I think. Yeah. Could chat afterwards, too. Cool. All right. Thank you.